Okay. So welcome everyone. Welcome to our matter presentation for kindergarten, which is kind of the first one for you because we don't have kindergarten living systems, which is the first one that we started at. So this is our first opportunity to have you, and we hope that you've had a moment to go through that introductory video because that was really important for everyone to see. If you didn't, it's still not too late to do that after you've finished our session today. That would be fine. We just want to make sure that you're clear on all of the sort of terminology that's going to get used throughout, because unlike the pilot, we're not going to go back over that on every session. So today we're going to do minimal review. We're just really going to dive right into matter, unpack it with you so that it's something that hopefully you'll be able to walk away today and have enough information to start planning your unit. We're going to ask everyone just to mute yourselves for now so we don't get any feedback. And then we'll encourage you at any point, though, if you have questions, by all means, just either throw them in the chat box or unmute yourself. That's even better. We're a small enough group, so that shouldn't be a big deal. It might be a little an adventure today because I'm not in my usual place with technology, so we'll try and see how we can make it all work. For those of you who don't know who we are, my name is Chris Arski. I'm one of the consultants with the CART Consortia and helping to roll out the math and the science this year and have a super awesome partner that I work with. And I'm going to let Ted introduce himself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ted Zeroni. I'm with the Edmonton Regional Learning Consortia and coming to you today from Sherwood Park. And it's been a challenge trying to keep up with Chris because she just keeps on going and going. So I've got a great working partner for sure.
So we're going to begin, as we will in every session. It will look a little different each time we do the acknowledgement. Wherever possible, we try to put something into the acknowledgement that would be relevant to that organizing idea as well that we're about to engage in, so that there's a connection there for you as well. So I'm going to do the acknowledgement first, and then I'm going to just talk a little bit about the Venn diagram that you're seeing in front of you. So in the spirit of reconciliation, we want to acknowledge that this gathering is taking place on traditional lands across the province of Alberta, home to many diverse First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. We acknowledge that this land is a traditional meeting ground, giving voice to its original peoples and the story of creation of this country in a way that history may have forgotten. So the Venn diagram is a really powerful tool that we can use in any course. This is not science specific, because it allows or provides for students to show us what they have learned in multiple contexts. So I can't ask you to complete a Venn diagram if I've only taught you facts on one thing. I need to know at least two or more things before I can have a conversation, or in this case, fill in a diagram, which allows me to say that I know something that is unique about one part, unique about the other part, but there are definitely components that they have in common. And so what I selected here was something that I used in land-based learning when we were working with a team of teachers. And this comes from Alaska, but the intent and the spirit of it could be applied anywhere. And what it talks about on the left-hand side, as you see, the left-hand circle is the traditional Native knowledge or understandings versus on the right-hand side, our Western science beliefs. And how do those two come together and find common ground? So those are what you're seeing inside, and you can kind of read it. We can get everyone just to mute themselves, please. That would be great. When we're going through this, if you look on the left-hand side, Indigenous views, land views, or world views are very holistic. Everything is included. One is not more important than the other. However, in Western science, we tend to look at parts of a whole. What is the whole? What is the most important piece? What part does that piece play in the whole, etc.? So I leave that for you to unpack. We won't go through the whole thing. It is very interesting, and it really speaks well to the Indigenous worldview. At the bottom, you find the link if you want the complete article and the research that went along with it. So what we're going to do today is really not go back over all of those things that we had in the past. We are assuming that because everyone is doing this in fall, that we're not having people jump in and select which organizing ideas they actually want to teach. So we are leaving you with the introductory video that you need to watch. And in that introductory folder, just as a quick reminder, are also videos on computing science, which is also part of our curriculum, and scientific method, which doesn't start for kindergarten, but it really wouldn't hurt to watch Nicole's video because she does talk very much through the lens of what a kindergarten teacher might be looking at. So talking a little bit about that, we're going to unpack the phases of learning, talk what concepts are. Do we know how to find those concepts? Because that's going to be really important. And then intertwined between everything that Ted and I will tag team back and forth as he's talking and takes you through concepts, then what we'll do is we'll go to what are some possible resources I could use to unpack and teach to the students with what Ted has just shown me. So that's kind of be our day, and we're going to go from there. So I'm going to turn it over to Ted and ask him to carry on from here.
All right, thanks, Chris. If you have seen the session one that's recorded, or if you've been with us through the pilot sessions, this diagram should look familiar with you. It's the Hattie Fisher-Fry phases of learning. And I'll just briefly go through it because, again, we're assuming that you've seen it all before. But the learning process, according to Hattie Fisher-Fry, goes through three processes, or three phases, I should say. First level is the surface level, not just the basic solid core understanding of individual skills and of the concepts. So when I'm talking about skills, I'm talking about a specific thing like sorting or comparing and contrasting or discussing even. So those are specific things that we want kids to learn how to do, and we can teach how to do those things at the surface level. When we're talking about concepts, we're not only talking about the definitions of concepts, but being able to find examples of concepts. So if we're using the concept of diversity, students not only know what it is, but they find examples of it in either videos or readings or different contexts we provide them. And again, if you've seen the previous session, we know that when we put those concepts together in a relationship, we get an understanding. And that becomes a deeper level of learning when you can connect three or more concepts together. And we'll give some examples shortly here. And so it's that understanding that really is the key piece to the science curriculum. And eventually I would just say all the curricula, the new ones that are coming out, that understanding piece is vitally important. And so we're going to spend some time looking at how to develop that after we work at the surface level stuff. Once we talk about transfer, we're really, in a sense, talking about context. We can study things and objects, in this particular case with kindergarten, in one context, give them different objects in another context. So we're looking at that context changing and students' ability to, the children's ability to do those things and work through those things independently. If you go to the next slide, we're just going to look at that a little bit closer. At the surface level, that's again where you do the concepts and skills. So let's just take a look at concepts again. Remember, they're just organizing ideas of one or two words. Fruit is a concept, and then that's where we have many examples of them. They have distinct attributes. We wouldn't include a carrot in there because it doesn't have the attributes of a fruit that make it so. So at the surface level, this is where we look at all the concepts in our organizing idea or our cusps, and we take time to teach them individually. When we talk about concepts in the curriculum, the next slide identifies all the ones that are in this particular organizing idea. You'll have a copy of this, you'll have a copy available to you, but I just like to sort of read through it because it may look complicated and it's really not that bad. But if we start at the beginning with the word objects, and if you had a copy of this, you can read closely, those arrows many times have little words attached. So in this particular case, so I can read objects, reading down, have properties. I'm going to the left that are perceived through the bottom senses, and then there are senses there. Once again, objects have properties, and then going down the schoolie line have properties such as, And then there's all the properties and things that are listed there. So this is a good way to organize the ideas for yourself, and gives you a big idea of what this organizing idea is about. Of course, we also take a look at similarities and differences of objects based on their properties. When we take a look at matter on a larger scale, one thing that we mentioned in the opening video is that this is very much a cyclical or spiraling type of curriculum, where in the past we would teach our science course. In kindergarten, we didn't have science before, but we'd teach what was in our science curriculum, if we had one at kindergarten, but certainly the other grades. And then the next grade would teach something different, and they were really disconnected. This new science curriculum really connects them all. One of the connecting pieces is the whole idea of the concepts and the big ideas. I've highlighted some things in orange there because one of the key concepts in kindergarten is properties. And we see that concept being another important principle you can see in grade 1 and grade 2, and we come back to it in grade 5. So that spiraling nature is part of the curriculum. And that's why we look at the surface deep transfer phases of learning, because at the end of the day, for students to really be successful in that grade, in the next grade, they need a deep understanding, and when that they're already in a transfer mode to carry on from grade to grade.
And just as a quick reminder, when you're looking at this, it should have already jumped out at you, but if you really are very new to the science yet and haven't had a chance to put your head into it, just a reminder that we're not kind of doing science in a box. You're not doing the topics and they kind of are start, finish in my grade, and then, you know, I'm done, and they move on to the next grade and they do 5 new topics. This is a spiraling curriculum in the sense that what concepts and you'd see, as Ted highlighted them here, that they're carrying through from one grade to the other. So they are no longer discrete. They are now very much connected, just like math is, just like language arts is. I teach you a concept in one grade, and that now is going to filter in as a support and starting point for the next grade. So clearly, kindergartens, you are the win-win scenario for next year, because you don't have to worry about whether they've shown up at your doorstep missing anything, because they're starting with you. You are the first ones to teach them science. But when we look at grade 1, grade 2, grade 3 in subsequent years next year, there are going to be grades that won't receive the grade 1 students with the background knowledge that they would have received from you. So there's bridging that's involved in science as well. Sorry, Ted.
No, thanks. Perfect. So this is not a repeat slide, you know, something different of it. So we're talking about the phases of learning then. What we're doing is looking at those key concepts. And that's why I have them circled there. We move not only from the definition of those concepts, but we move, and that's why we've got the 3-dimensional figure with the cubes, as we go beyond definitions and have kids or students look for examples of that concept. In any given context, they see a picture you would ask them, for example, see if they can identify examples of diversity in that picture, or whatever the concept might be, or whatever the context might be. Now, so what we're going to do is unpack this a little bit different, I think, than we have in the past. So bear with us. If we go to the next slide, what we're really looking at is when we're planning then to teach the science curriculum here. The key thing is to remember to begin with the understanding. That's probably the most important part in terms of the lines of the cusp, is that understanding. In this particular case, we can read that objects have identifiable properties. So if we were to look at that and then look to the left, we could, in the understanding, know that there's 2 key concepts there, objects and properties. So when we look to the left, we can see that object is defined there. We're talking about objects being something that is perceived by senses. So that's another important concept. Properties is defined there, and examples of properties are also listed there. So those 3 key concepts, property, object, and sense, would be ones then that we begin teaching at the surface level, working with them individually so students fully know what they are before we start putting them together in that understanding. Sometimes in kindergarten, all your definitions and examples should be there. In some grades, the definition won't be there, or examples won't be there because they would have been taught at a previous grade. So on to the next slide then. What you'll probably want to do when you is also then consider the skills. When I'm talking about the skill, I'm not talking about the skill and procedure statement as we see it there. I'm talking about the individual thing, the individual learned ability that someone do that they can perform. For example, they may be able to design, they may be able to evaluate, they may be able to compare and contrast those specific things. And a procedure is simply a sequence of steps to get some things done. In our science course, for example, not at the kindergarten level, but the scientific method or the process or procedure of investigation is a series of steps, beginning with a question and so on. So those are the two things that we have to focus on as well. If we go to the next slide, I'll show you how we bring that into the surface level as well. I guess it's not the next slide. The slide. I include this slide right now because when I talk about the specific skills, those are the ones that are all listed on the left-hand side. For example, asking questions, drawing a conclusion, describing, discussing, exploring, recording data, making relationships, relating. Those are all individual skills. What this list is one we made up that takes all the skills and procedures questions from or statements from all grades and all curriculum, or all grades and all organizing ideas in the primary science grades, and they're all listed there. And you can see that there's quite a similarity in the type of skills that are being used. Some aren't introduced till later grades, but some are introduced in kindergarten and continue all the way up. The ones with the light shade means that they're skills that kids still need to be doing the other grades, but they're kind of hidden. They're not included in a skills and procedure statement. So for example, asking questions is one of the skills and procedures verbs that show up, but it doesn't show up in the other grades, but that's because it's embedded in the investigation process, which is the first step is to ask questions. So the left-hand side are all those specific skills that we want to make sure that before we move too fast in getting kids to use them, we want to make sure we take an opportunity to teach them so that they can become fairly competent in them. So that's when we go to the next slide then. That's something we also work at the surface level. Chris, unless you had something you wanted to add?
No, good. Just couldn't get my technology to go.
So, we're still working at the surface level. What are we going to teach at the beginning? What do we want to get our students to really have a good handle on? So it's not only concepts, but we go to that skills and procedures column and draw in those specific skills. In this, we've got sort, for example, describing and exploring. And at this level in kindergarten, quite often explore means to observe something carefully or to do something like that. And we'll get the sense of that as we move along. So before you even start teaching or instructing now, what you'll want to make sure is just as we always do as educators, is do some pre-assessment. Do kids know what property means, or what the senses are, what objects are? Can they sort? Do they know how to describe? Can they observe or explore? If they can do those things, we move on to the instruction level. But if they don't, then we need some time at the surface level instructing to those things. And so that's what we're going to do. We're going to take, again, looking at our first understanding, which is objects have identifiable properties, and take a look at some sample learning activities that you can use at this level. One of the skills, again, was to sort, right? So if students have never sorted, or your children have never sorted, we can go to that one. You can go to an introduction to sort. It'll tell you some steps to do and how we do sorts. So that's just there for your use if you want to click on it when you get a chance. But otherwise, sorry?
Did you want to go through it or not?
No, I don't think we need to go through it. It's pretty self-explanatory. So, but if your students haven't sorted, if you're not too sure if they can, this is a good way to explain it to them.
Yeah, and for any of you who've just joined us late, you will all be getting a copy of the slide deck. So when we talk about it, you can go to it later, you'll have access to these links and you can just go into those. So what you're looking at when Ted talks about have they ever sorted before, this is a procedure or a way that I find out what students know, and I do use it at any grade because I think it's really valuable and it gives me a lot of information about the students. I don't necessarily teach them the word sort, and I wouldn't even necessarily in kindergarten anyway, but I wouldn't teach them the word sort here. I might be inclined, and this is me, this is just a sample idea that you can take or and change as you wish. But I actually prefer just to give kids cards and just put them either on their own, and because there's a lot of them in this deck, I put them in pairs or in groups of threes. And all we say to them is simply, put things together that you think belong there, or just how would you like to clean these up a little bit? And they just randomly start making their piles, and they'll do sort of what you would expect them to do. Things like food will go together, things that are toys or things that they could use, something like that would go together. Plants might go together, whatever they're seeing, and they all will end up, they don't all end up with the same piles, that is for sure. Things that smell funny to them or foods they like to eat even get their own piles. So there's lots of ways that they can do this, but the whole idea of the sort is, first of all, once I've got these piles, regardless of the piles, because I didn't tell you what to put in the piles and I don't want to, I'm going to walk around and say, can you tell me about this pile? Can you tell me about this pile? To hear what their thinking is, because as Ted said, you need to pre-assess. And if they already have good language and good understanding and some reasoning already moving towards those sorting of the groups, I'm hearing language or I'm hearing terminology that I was actually thinking I might have to teach them, then that allows me to really move ahead and get a little bit deeper with them already. But if not, that's a good starting point. And we'll always assume it's a not, we build from there. So that would be one way I would use these. These cards will also be available to you to use. And as the students are, like I said, finishing them, we might go around and ask the groups, can you talk to us a little bit about the kinds of piles that you have? So you might see on the top left-hand corner some of the words that the students gave to us, that these were colored things. I put all the same colored things together, or we put all the food things together, or things that go outside, or things that had people in it, or things that were smelly, whatever, right? Where are we going? Well, we're going into, remember, there to know the difference between what's an object and what's the property of an object. And we're going to ask them eventually to involve their senses. So when I see those kinds of lists just getting started, I'm already seeing that they're talking about smelly things, right? And that's my start and my link into those conversations. Or that they said color was one. Well, there's a property of items or objects, right? So you could start that create on the right-hand side a word wall with your students and just have it continuously build. And then as we introduce the word property, then we can start to pull out the words that described properties. Were there any words that described objects? Were there any words that were actually now starting to link when we bring in the word senses? So you're building with them without stand up and delivery and telling them, right? That's the difference of letting them kind of come through it. Now, would I do sorting at the same time in math? You betcha I would. I would be doing sorting at the same time that I'm doing sorting in science. So whatever it is you might be working on, maybe you're sorting colors, maybe you're sorting shapes that look the same, maybe you're asking them to put things into groups of twos. I mean, leverage and do the interconnections right there, the cross-curricular connections that we can. This is a book that comes from a Pearson small library or Spark library, and it's called Sort It. And it works really well in here because it not only talks about big, small, it has animals, it connects to science so beautifully as well. So that's why we're showcasing it here, because it fits in both worlds. Okay, turn it over to you, Ted.
Well, yeah, this is just another, moving on to another surface level thing. Remember, one of the skills was explore, and at kindergarten level, quite often exploring is, in this particular case with this outcome, is exploring with our senses. And so we make, when we're doing exploration with our senses, we're essentially observing. So what we want to look at now is what is it that we are doing when we're making an observation? Again, we don't have to go through this. This is just a concept attainment lesson, self-containing thing, but it just helps to clarify what is that concept of observation. We say, make an observation. What does it mean? And this is a step-by-step one that can help you out if you want to try that.
You want to just generally explain what a concept attainment is?
Sure.
Just
Well, maybe do you feel comfortable opening it up? I know you're working with new technology on your side, Chris.
find out.
Find out. So we're talking about concept attainment activities. We're talking about that whole notion of giving examples and non-examples and having kids make conclusions or drawing hypotheses and testing things to help come to an understanding about what it is we're trying to explain to them. So the first page always has an explanation of what the strategy is. It doesn't change for each lesson that has these. If you go to the next slide, Chris, we'll see how they kind of work. Now, again, these are fairly generic. They probably need to be changed for kindergarten or for different grade levels. But this is just an example of observing with sight. So if we can go through it, then this is where you give the examples and non-examples. So in this particular case, an example of an observation is the bow is yellow versus the baby's mother made the bow. And we keep on going through a series of examples. The baby is smiling versus the baby is happy to see. The baby is on a blanket, and so on. And then if we go to the next slide, then we'll think of those are all observations. Can you think of another observation, something you can see with your eyes? And then similar thing with touch and so on. And then the end, in this case, an observation is the plant is prickly. Not an observation. I think this is called a burr. Next slide. Again, example of an observation and a non-example. And this entire one goes through all the five senses and making observations with the five senses. So that gives you an idea of what those concept attainment lessons are like. So we don't have to go through the whole thing, I don't think, Chris. It's pretty self-explanatory. So when you see that word concept attainment, it's that giving examples, non-examples, and kids coming to a hypothesis about what it is that we're looking at, and then creating examples of it. So to help, and usually as an introduction to those. So that's another thing to work at the surface level if they're not too sure what an observation is. And Chris, we're going on to senses.
Right. And so senses is one of those ones we saw, at the surface level. I need to, first of all, if I'm going to use my senses, that's the application side of it, but I need to understand what they are first. And the students in kindergarten have a pretty good starting point of senses. They may not have all the language and vocabulary, but really that's what we want them to learn. Now, again, this is my approach. When I'm doing senses, for example, I probably wouldn't say, we have five senses and just point to my eyes and my ears and my nose. I would do that eventually. But I think I prefer for them to maybe watch a video, maybe listen to a story that I read to them and start asking them questions about, again, it's that cross-curricular piece, but what have I seen? What did I hear in the video that helps me to recognize ways that I can find out things that I have around me, that I can see, that I can touch. And so there's a short video in here called The Five Senses. And so just on the top left, it says, listen carefully and see if you can remember the five senses. You might not even say that there's five, but I do. I just say, do you know what the five are? And then together as a class, we talk about them at the end. And then also it just gives us a chance to listen to what do they hear? What do they remember? And unpacking a little bit more about whatever they add on in their descriptors of those words as we go through, because again, that's good formative assessment for me as a teacher. There's also a learning song there, and then there's also another little quiz almost. Like it's very much like the yes or no. Is this something that's using a sense? What organ in my observable face can I use if I want to smell something? Right, fairly straightforward and simple, but still, those are important parts of. I need to learn the senses first before I'm going to do something with them. So the concept of object, that's another one that we have. Remember, objects and properties, those two conversations or two components that we saw in the understanding. Again, I need to know what is an object. And a lot of times they don't actually know that objects are everything that they're dealing with on a day-by-day basis. We've just never named it that way. So this gives us an opportunity to properly put those together. And again, I'll let Ted just talk about the concept attainment one here.
Once again, it's fairly straightforward. Again, we don't have to open up all the way. When you see that again, it's just focusing on giving a name to what an object is. You can open it up if you want for an example, but it's just giving examples, non-examples of what a concept is or what an object is, and asking students at the end, well, looking at the examples, what we think an object is. And again, they could be changed. So students probably know what census is before you. This one is taking place. So we'll keep on going. So we can take a look at examples. Lollipop is an example of an object. Sweet is not. A pond is. Wet is not. And we go on through all these other examples. A storm cloud is, and so on. And then we start posing some questions. We tell what an object is. And then we have kids test them, so if their ideas, right, which is an example of an object, right? And that's how that goes through. So they're made to, you'll have access to the slideshows. They're made to put in whatever slideshows you want. You could take some of the pictures and print them out. It might be easier at the kindergarten level to do that than do an actual slideshow.
Okay. So again, within the slideshow itself, you might want to just pick out some objects and just put them around the room. I'm just giving you samples that you could say and just ask the students, are any of these an object? And the answer is all of them are. But again, just letting them discern, go around, if they say, no, this isn't an object, you might want to ask them, explain your thinking, right? You'll want to know, why are you thinking this isn't? Let's go back to, what did we know about an object? What do we know about how we would define or how we would name an object? I can see it and I can touch it, right? If I feel it, I can touch it that way. So every one of these is an object. And then we can ask them, do you find any more objects around the room? And they should be able to say, well, everything in the room is an object. Good. That's kind of where we want to get to. Same thing with the concept of properties, right? Objects have properties, ways that I can describe those objects. So is the object smooth? Is it blue? Is it red? Is it shiny? Is it dull? Those are all properties. And as Ted mentioned earlier, when you looked at the concept progression, that's a key for students as they start moving through the science curriculum. This is one that comes up over and over and over again. So the starting point is in kindergarten. That's really an important one.
And I'm not going to go through this exercise, but you'll notice I put observable, property observable, and that's again a concept attainment lesson, examples, non-examples. We're not going to show this one. You could look at it when you have an opportunity later on. But I included the word observable with it. It's not in your organizing idea or your CUSP curriculum is that way. But when we get into grade 1 and grade 2 and so on, we talk about measurable properties and changeable properties. So just going to throw that on there, as we call these things, observable properties, because we can see them with our senses, or we can observe them with our senses. But Chris is right, that word property is hugely important, because quite often what students will do, and we'll maybe see later on when we're talking about the describing words, is they'll confuse the property, such as shape, with the actual description, round. And so we want to make sure that there's a distinction between that describing word and the property.
Exactly. So really what we're unpacking with them is, do they know what is an object and what makes it an object? And how do I know I can call it an object? And then what are the characteristics of that? Then what's the properties of those objects? So there's where we're going to go and maybe break it down in smaller chunks for them. But can they describe them? Those descriptive words that Ted was just talking about is kind of our end goal. And so that means a little bit of critical thinking has got to be put into this too. I have to have some ways to describe different things. I have to experience those different sensations and those different feels or describing words before I can remember to use them myself. So, we need to expose them to rough surfaces, soft surfaces, gooey, small, put a blast of some water in a plastic bag and let them feel that, just so that they have those different sensations, not just they're there, but they actually never experience them. So when we get into the senses and we get into this whole notion of descriptive words for properties, slowing down and taking a day for touch, a day for how I see things and How might I not see things as clearly as others? Like all those different senses and different ways that we're going to integrate those a day at a time, for sure, with each one would be more than appropriate, because you don't want to rush this. This isn't a quick surface sort of overview that we want to have. And we want the students on the right-hand side to use the terminology in kindergarten, right? We want them to know what a property is, and we want them to be able to say the properties of this are, and then go from there, right? We really want that terminology to be there. So the difference between your object and your property, anything that you can see or touch, anything that can be actually basically perceived by the senses. So one of the step ups, and this isn't a kindergarten, but just to give you a sense of this, when the step up into this would be into grade 1, where we say, can you go home and find an item that you could perceive with all 5 senses? And then maybe next day you send them home and say, now I'd like you to find an object that you can only use 1 sense to identify. And that's a tough call. They're going to have a tough search for that, because that's not the easy thing in the world, almost impossible in some cases. And then we talk about the properties, so the characteristics of objects. So things like the color, the size, the shape, and texture. And I did include a number of different videos too that you have references to from the Edmonton Catholic resources, where one of them is a video on texture. Children need to know that word. I know it's not in the curriculum per se, like upfront teach them texture, but it is a property. And it's an important one for them to know. So again, that's a word that I would spend a little bit of time on and give them lots of opportunities.
So again, even still at the surface level, one of those skills is describe, and is in most cases, when we take a skill, there's always that associated concept that goes with it. So if we describe something, we're actually giving a description. And again, this is one of those skills and concept that goes from kindergarten all the way up. Describe is used is quite often in all the grades. So this is where they're first introduced to it. So this is, again, concept attainment stuff about what is a description, examples, non-examples, and a little bit description practice for them if they wanted as well. The next slides that Chris is going to show you are some really helpful words about describing words.
And that may just go back to that chart that we were saying, building up on your wall. I would have one that would be similar to this as well. As we encounter different kinds of things with our senses, what are the words that we would use when I see them? What are the words when I touch them? What are the words that when I smell them? So what are the words that we could use? And this is not a fixed list. It could be anything that they can come up with. And in some cases, even with the little ones, they'll come up with stinky. It's stinky. Well, they all know what it means. I mean, it's not probably the word that we necessarily want to use, but it works. And it's exactly the kind of descriptor that all of them would relate to. So just continuing that sort of list of words, descriptive words, will help them later when we start to give them new contexts and new opportunities to try things out. One of another books that you'll find in that library that I'll show you where to find that library at the end, is called Tell Me About It. And in this case, they're showing quite vivid, different types of this case. It's fruits and vegetables that they'll have in here in different surface levels. But you can see very distinctly the differences between them. So do they have the words to describe that? Do they know that this is a rough look to it? This has a smooth look to it. And if they were to feel that, or if making it comes up later, but making a feely bag, where once I'm really good at my words and once I have a good vocabulary stacked up in my head that I can use for descriptions, what if you walked around with a bag, and I have to just put my hand in the bag and describe what I'm feeling, but I don't get to see it. I don't get to actually name it because I would almost have to figure it out as my hand is in the bag. Kids love that kind of thing, but it's also a way for us to see what's their vocabulary. How are they doing with this understanding piece? So unpacking our senses related to senses and properties, we see that we have the senses listed at the top, and then we have properties of those senses that are listed below. So again, just every day when they come in finding something, name a sense that they have to go find something with it. And what did they see? Describe it based on what they have. Okay, what's the properties of it? But then as Ted mentioned too, that once they're getting good at that, we want to go one step further and make sure that they use descriptive words, right, for those properties. And so just that word wall, just building it up, giving me good strategies of things that I can use so that they can just use that when you give them a new item. So giving them lots of opportunities of things in the classroom, giving them a new location. Let's go in the hallway. Let's get out of the hallway. Let's go outside while we can. Let's see what there is outside that I can find, and what are the textures that I can find, and how will I describe them, and which of the objects can I name the objects, and what are the properties of that object, and what were the descriptive words I would use. So again, just new context. Once I've got the basics, the surface level information of both the skill and the the knowledge piece, I'm ready to go out and try some new locations. And if I get stumped as soon as I go out of the classroom, then maybe I'm not clearly yet understanding, right? You've thrown me into a new scenario and I'm not able to really connect to it yet. So maybe we need to go back and find out what it is that's holding them back.
So once we go through, getting kids familiarity with the little skills that they're going to be needing through the to work with that deeper understanding, describing and sorting and those kinds of things and all those related concepts. Now we go into the to the deep part. And again, the deep part is where we take those connections, such as the relationship between objects and properties. And the understanding, first one, is that objects have identifiable properties. So how do we put that together, and how do we get kids to create that understanding or come up with that conclusion that, hey, all objects have properties that I can identify? And so that's where we're going to next.
So you could take those same cards, and I'm a big advocate. If you've got cards, they should get used definitely more than once and in different ways. So they just put them in piles. And remember, we were generating words from that. And maybe the next day you gave them the cards and just said, put them in new piles. Still not with any targeted sort of direction about which the piles should be related to. But now I'm going to change it and say, what are the senses? And there are cards that have the pictures of the senses on there. And they can use those as sort of pile markers on the floor or on their desk or table. And now we're going to ask them to resort the cards again, but this time paying attention to the senses. So which of the pictures belongs to smell, which one belongs to taste, etc. And this is where you probably will encounter that conversation where students will say, well, I think this fits in 2 places. I think it fits in these 2 places. And so maybe then we start that introduction about that Venn diagram that we looked at the beginning and the conversation we had about of its importance. We're not throwing it in here yet, but in the end, I really would love them to get to that point where I can say, oh, you got some cards that you think belong to both. Maybe what we could do is, if you had smell and you had taste side by side and you think they belong to both, why don't we just start a column down the middle? And when we do that, we're going to pretend that they belong to both sides. You're really tooling them up for that Venn diagram, that curriculum comparison piece that we want them to do. So again, when you look at that, do you want to talk about the deep? I'll let you jump in here, Ted.
No, yeah, that's right. This diagram is trying to show again. So we've been through the surface. So we've got all those individual skills practiced, at least, if not necessarily good at, but practiced, and they're familiar with them. And they know what those concepts are. Now we work at the understanding, and that's where you look at the skills and procedure statement, where they're going to explore or observe the properties of objects using one or more senses. That's where they're going to be describing properties of various objects or sorting them and so on. And when they do those things, it's always important to come back to the understanding. And, and since asking that question, do objects have identifiable properties? Show me. Another reason why I'm showing this particular graphic is because, again, those 3 statements they're meant to help develop that understanding, and we want to draw that out of them. But we're not just limited to those. Again, for example, I could say, represent how, if you could draw me a picture to show that objects have different properties. Now they're doing a representation to show you that same understanding, that they could talk about it and explain it. So when I showed you that list of all the verbs from kindergarten to grade 3, if you look at that kindergarten column, you could probably take any of those verbs and develop it into an activity that will help to demonstrate and deepen their understanding of that understanding. So we can move on, Chris. Yeah, and that's what I just talked about with this. When we're talking about assessments, formative assessments with this understanding, the examples Chris is giving are good examples of different formative assessments, because all you really do with this is change the context, change the objects, change the situation where you're in. Gives kids the more as many opportunities to do it. As she mentioned, have them go at home or sporadically in the classroom, look at it at a different object and so on. It's those kinds of things that deepen their understanding when we can do the skills and procedures at various times using different contexts.
So we see how students took the header cards for the senses and then they sorted accordingly, right? And again, some kids will maybe have different cards in different places, and that's a good time for them, even at kindergarten, to have that discussion, right? And I know that might not be the one we want to necessarily highlight right now, but let's talk about, why did you put something in that pile, but your group next to you didn't put it there? So why don't you ask them, and why don't you talk about that and find out why they're in different places, right? What's the reasoning? There's also read alouds that we could use that, you know, just to reiterate this. And with every video that I share, or with every storybook that's in here, there's always a little bit of a different perspective. And again, something for them to take away to deepen their understanding as well. And then below that, you've got 25 senses activities. If you're looking for ideas, again, just to deepen that knowledge of what they have and how they're going to apply it, then you might want to look at some of those and just get a sense if any of those would work for you. Oops. There's another book in that series again called Looking Up. And you'd think, wow, this belongs to a space unit. Well, to a certain degree it does. But really what this book is about is using their senses. Using their senses to see the night sky, for example. Using their senses to go out and experience the smell of nature. Those are the kinds of things that's in here. So those are the little books that we would want to read for them, and ask them, you know, which sense do you think that they're using, and how is that? How do we know that? What would give us the evidence for that? Or do we have any properties that we see of the object that they're holding in their hand, or whatever's in the story? We could also, as we just said, resort them again. Maybe you want to put 2 senses together. Does that change my piles? Does it just just slide them over, or does it actually give me different ways to look at the cards? Could they find other objects in the room that they could add to their senses one that we did? Like, what other ones could they find in the room that they could quickly go and grab? So just some ideas are given in here, but we want it to be seamless between the whole terminology of the objects and the senses that I'm using between identifying those objects and what are the properties of them. So we want it to sort of flip back and forth as much as we can. So again, objects have identifiable properties. You can just have a look. These are just ideas. Again, nothing more than that. They could have them describe some identifiable properties. One of the slides I'm going to show you here shortly is, I just did a walk around the house just to find what are some things I could put in front of them that could be descriptors. So again, bring something from home. Bring something from home that's really unique, that you don't think anybody in your class would know what it is. Well, that's even more fun, because now I have to figure out what it is. And then we can talk about, you know, what the object's properties are and what sense would I have used for that particular, or is there more than one sense that I would have used? So parents travel, or you have a particular culture and there's some particular item that they would like to bring. This is a nice way to make those connections in the classroom. What about some of the things that sit in the classrooms? So for example, our wooden blocks, right? I could ask the question, do wooden blocks, does the design of the block in any way shape or change the design of what I can build? So again, we know that when things have curved sides to them, I can't stack them as easily. But that's, again, it's a property of that block that it's got curves and it's got some straight lines. So when I look at some of these designs that I see in here, I probably can't get my mouse to come down, but if I'm looking at that sort of wooden castle on the right-hand side, that gives me a place where I can go through and have a look and see what students can use for descriptors. Or you've got the wooden geometric solids that you have, those wooden ones that we use that have the rectangles, the prisms on it, and the cylinders, and they're just the wooden ones. What are there? Those are sitting around schools everywhere. Bring those out. And how does that change maybe my design? But what's the properties that make my design easier to make, and what are properties that might hinder? You've got the stones, the building stones that you can have too. And I put a link there because some people had never seen or heard of the stones before. So again, what are some properties of those stones? There's colors, there's different shapes. The flat sides occur in different places. Would that change my design? And then you've got a link at the top for STEM building blocks as well, which is what those were. Okay, I'll turn it back over to Ted. Oh, you're muted, Ted.
I keep doing that. So what we've just been spending time doing is going through that surface, developing the different concepts and skills to develop that understanding that objects have identifiable properties. Now, so we move on to the second understanding, and that is that objects can be more similar or similar in more or one properties or different in another property. So we look at the next slide, then that same kind of graphic as we had before, you notice where our understanding has changed now. We've kind of worked with that first understanding. We've given all kinds of opportunities and all these different kind of contexts, including the ones with the different stackers that Chris had in the previous slide. But now we move on that objects may be similar in one or more property and different in another property. Again, we pull out those concepts. They're not listed on the knowledge section, but we're really talking about how things may be similar or different. We're talking about things having a similarity or a difference. And so knowing the difference between a similarity and difference may be something that has to be taught at the surface level, maybe not. You would have to do some pre-assessment and so on. And then we're getting into comparing and contrasting again, would be something, there would be new words to the students if they ever heard them. But now we're using that. So that's where we take that compare verb and we bring it to the surface level, make sure students understand what comparing means or comparing, contrasting, before we say to them, okay, we'd like you to compare and contrast these different objects. So we're going to go again through some sample activities that can be done at the surface level and then move into the deep where we get to the understanding again. So again, this is just, again, that concept attainment kind of an activity just to distinguish the concepts, similarity and difference. And once they know that, that's a good surface level learning thing. It'll need practice. Again, these activities aren't, say, you do this activity once and they're going to know these concepts. It's a new way to introduce them and keep working with them in different contexts, as Crystal's going to show you as we move along here.
So one of them would be, if I want to get a little bit deeper here, I really want them to now use those senses that we were talking about, right? Compare sight to touch. And are there unique pieces to it? Are there commonalities to it? So that's that compare and contrast piece using a Venn diagram. And I've just put in the top right-hand corner here, quick snapshots that the best Venn diagrams are hula hoops. And that gets me out of my chair, not with a piece of paper and pencil in front of me. So maybe you give me some cards and or pictures, whichever, if I can't read the words yet, I get pictures on cards and I put them into the right circle. And initially, even with a kindergarten student, I would be inclined to put both. They have both sight and touch. The first time I do this with them on the floor, and we would model one of these obviously, but when I'm doing this on the floor, I'm up and about. And so that gives me a little bit more excitement and engagement. But after I've done a couple of these, I don't put both in the middle anymore. That's something that they should be able to start to remember and work their way through. So again, here would be one way that we could definitely address both those skills and those concepts. And then I go back to even where we were at the very beginning, right? When we showed you sort of the differences between traditional Native knowledge and Western science and what's common ground in between. So again, it's as important for the little ones as it is for us to make those connections between there are some unique pieces and then there are some common pieces.
Now we get to that final phase again, where we are talking about transfer, and really transfer is really an assessment piece as well. We're talking about transfer. We're basically talking about giving kids an opportunity to demonstrate what they know or understand in a new context and with increasing independence. So we can use those exact same skills and procedure statements for an assessment piece, but we just change up the context. And, and Chris, when you were explaining about your blocks, I mean, that would be a really good transfer piece as well, using those different shaped rocks and stackers to talk about that as an assessment, saying, are these, how do these, what's the properties of these stackers that make them, why are you choosing them? Why are you choosing the slot side? To focus on the different properties, of course. And the same goes with the compare contrast component. Again, you could just give students just different examples and different items to compare and contrast as we go up and down the line. So as you do your formative assessments along the way at the deep level, because you're always giving them a new context, that'll be when you get to decide that, okay, I can see if they really know this independently on their own at the transfer level. On the next slide, I just want to point out one thing here. And going back to the skills and procedures, you take a look at the left three columns. Those are right out of the curriculum guide. And those are all the knowledge and understanding and the skills that we've been working at. And you notice I have them colored. You'll get a copy of this, and if you can't read it, that's fine at this point. But I just want to point out that what I've done with the color coding is I've linked the skills and procedure statements with either the understanding and or the knowledge piece. And the reason I did that is because when we talk about what the definition of a skill, of the skills and procedures are, the guiding framework defines that as the skills and procedures are what students do to demonstrate their knowledge or understanding. So they're going to describe to demonstrate their understanding, or they're going to describe to talk about what it is, the properties, so that you can demonstrate their understanding of properties. Or they're to compare to demonstrate their understanding that objects have similarities and differences. So you can see they're linked to certain things, but there are some words in there that are blacked out. Well, those are things that don't have a skills and procedure statement, but we know, for example, in order to move on to that understanding, for students to make those understandings, they need to know what senses are. So we'd want to do some assessment at that level. We also know that what a property is. Students really need to know that and distinguish property from descriptive words. They're two separate things. And so we would need some kind of assessment for that. And those are not listed in the skills and procedure statement. So we'll have to make those on our own. And what I have on the other side is, again, just that list of the overall kindergarten science skill words there. Those are ones that I think can be used at any time. Just because they're not identified here in this organizing idea with matter doesn't mean we can't use them, because when you think about all those skills that you'll see there, asking questions, describing, exploring, relating ideas together, representing, sorting, they can be used in every course and at every organizing idea in science. I don't think they're intended to just stay in science. We know we use them all the time. But the more we highlight them and talk about what they are, the better kids to get at them, because these same skills show up again in grade 2, grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, and so on. So if we work together as groups and saying, these are going to make sure that kids get a good introduction to these, and we keep on doing it down the road, certainly that skill is going to transfer and students become much more adept at that as they go through the grades.
And these skills that we're talking about aren't specific just to kindergarten, as Ted said, just to reiterate that every grade has that same requirement, that we're teaching the skills to the students and assessing. So this is an ongoing, it's going to be our first year, but over time, our students should become very good at those applications of the skills and understanding the meaning of them. Certainly, with each grade, we add some complexity to it, but they're not going to be only, as you saw in that first chart where the pink was, that they're not in every grade, but that doesn't mean that we wouldn't still use them. So just here you have a number of formative assessments. That's all they are, straight formatives about, do I know 5 senses? It's just a worksheet kind. Sometimes it's a matching, sometimes it's a word that they might be looking for. So these are all freeware. They come from K5 Learning, which we are able to access. So that would be a source. And readworks.org is another one that we can use as well. What about for properties? Okay, this is my little walk around the house. So just in a simple 5-minute walk, what do I have that I can have students describe properties, and then what descriptive words would they use? So, and these are just ideas, right? I'm just saying you could do the same thing and grab whatever you have. I've just got some dried flowers, but they have some of the little sort of cranberries in them too. So very different textures in these petals when the students are going to feel them. Stuffies, right? Stuffies are great because stuffies sometimes have, fabric eyes, and sometimes they have plastic eyes, and sometimes they have real boots on, and they're excellent. And some have shaggy fur and some don't have shaggy fur, right? So it's sort of picking and choosing whatever would be that they could bring a stuffy from home, right? What's your favorite stuffy? Bring it. On 100 Day, when you usually bring in bears or 100 bears on the day, there's another one. These are vases, and vases are great when you're looking for kids to give you property descriptions, because when you run your hands over them, they usually have different surfaces and they alternate. These are very rough, and compared to this is very smooth, but very beveled, and there's waves at the bottom. Again, that's just a sample. These ones are metal, but in the metal is etched these pictures. So again, a very different kind of texture. And again, I'm going to be using different senses to look at that. Bears, right? These are bears that you can have in the house, out of the house, but you run your hand over this and it's very, very rough, but very textured. And how would I describe that? And the face is different again. So just what do you have around? Just even make it more fun, have everybody bring one item, and then you set up stations in the classroom and they can walk around. They could pick 5 of the different stations for a descriptor, or they randomly choose their number and that's the one they have to go to. Just having a little bit of fun with what comes from home, as well as what makes a little bit of meaning to them as well. All right, I do have some lists for resources for you. Some possible extensions would be things like creating a touch book. They could make their own little book where they have different surface textures or different things that they would use for descriptors. A feely bag, like I talked about, where they walk around and put their hand in, right? Shoebox of items where they blindfold them and they have to describe what they have. So just some ideas are there. And remember, pretty much any deep one could be changed into transfer if I just come up with a new context that I bring them in. So you've really got lots of endless possibilities here. But again, there's some suggestions that you might want to have. Take a sensory walk outside, maybe. Especially with our weather being so nice right now, why don't we take advantage of it? Again, the read alouds that we talked about, you could use some of those in the activities. So just bring those back because those are important for us to consider. All right, don't freeze on me now. And we have another book that, although we don't have the scientific method, What a Scientist Sees is a really neat little book for them to read. We do recommend it for grade 1 as well, but it just ties into the senses so well that it seems kind of logical to have a bit of a conversation about that scientific method at this point. So that is, again, another one of your resources that you could use. Inside that book, they have all kinds of little ideas to teach and things that you can do for activities. There's another one too that comes from On the Mark Press. Some of you, depending on how long you've been teaching and what you've been teaching, are familiar with this. On the Mark Press has for years created books. They're consumable books that we could use that were directly tied to Alberta science curriculum. And this is one of those samples that comes from the old grade 1, now kindergarten. But you can still purchase these. They have great diagrams in them. They're still not hands-on, right? And we really are encouraging the active participation of the students. But again, this is a great little resource if you are looking for some additional pieces. So on this slide here, you'll see I've given you a link to find out where it's at. There is a cost for it, but just so that you know where to find it. And here are where we got the books from. They come from the Pearson Spark Library. And if you're interested in looking at some of the small books, we are going to be making recommendations, not just from the library, but other small books as well. But if you're interested in that, there is a 30-day trial that you can access. So just click that link on at the bottom and you can go in, you can read all the books that you want to see what's there that you might want to get somewhere down the line. And see if there's something there that would help your classroom library or that you might want to use for reading or for stories or whatever the case may be. We don't know yet if any of those books are going to be posted to the New Learn Alberta site, but and that's possible, kind of like the Mathology was, but we have not heard anything yet. So right now, if you just want to go in and have a look and read them and just see kind of what I've been posting in there that fit the kindergarten ones. So we have 8 minutes left. I'm actually not going to play this because it is longer than that, but we do have a computing science designed or recording completed for you. We have partners that are helping us out that aren't here with us, but they're here always in these links. So you will get to meet them through that. In particular, the computing science, you'll meet Ange Deering. Ange Deering is one of the lead ed techs that works with Wetaskiwin Regional Public Schools. And she is going to create for every grade in every organizing idea. So Kindergarten Matter, she's already done Living Systems, but Kindergarten Matter, she has a short 10-minute recording about what is computing science, first of all, and secondly, what does it look like for a Kindergarten Matter unit that I'm going to be teaching. So she'll give you some examples of things that tie directly into computing science, just so that we also hear people that are quite anxious. They're saying, I don't know anything about computing science. I don't teach it. I thought that's an option. You do have options in over older levels where we call them computing science, but in the terms of computing science for primary, we're really talking about language. We're not talking about programming robots and doing computer work per se. We are looking at how do you give instructions just to start with, and how do students follow instructions? And what's the language, those words, just like we had the vocab that we taught them in Matter, what's the language that a student needs to be familiar with in computing science that they learn all the way through their years of education? So that's what Ange will go through with you. And I think you'll really appreciate it when you see how well she's kind of just succinctly says, here's a card sort, for example, here's what it would be. Here's how we would name it if we were doing computing science. So that'll get you started for sure. We also in the introductory folder, when we do the introductory session, there is one in there called What I Have to Teach Computing Science as well. It's taught by Janet Bell. It is a longer one, but she really will unpack this whole idea of computing science and what does it really mean to me as the teacher in general. Computing science lives in your science curriculum, but it is not only about science. It originally was in the math, designed to go in the math. It lives in math. It lives in LA. It lives everywhere. So it's one of those things, again, kind of like concept everywhere that the kids are doing work in school. So they'll start to become more familiar with it as we start to do a little bit more work with it. Anything else you want to add to that, Ted?
No, maybe just go to the next slide and yeah, I can help explain that a little bit. So what we've got here is just some things pulled out of the computer science curricula from kindergarten to grade 3, so you can get a sense of sort of some of the flow and the progression. Now, these are just based on some groupings that we've made. It's not the entire kindergarten. If you look at that column, that's not everything in the computer science program in terms of skills and procedures, but they're ones that they have in common, and we could see a progression with all the grades. We take a look at the yellow one. You don't have to read it now, but at this point, what you're doing at kindergarten is having kids, the yellow ones are having kids follow instructions. And in grade 1, they're continuing to follow instructions. If we go down to the pink, that's where we're getting our students to create instructions or making a series of steps or sequence to reach a certain outcome. And you could see that creating a sequence of steps and following steps sort of continues along the grades there. And again, just in terms of a context, what this really, one of the big things with computer science is something called computational thinking. And that whole notion of working with instructions, creating them, following them is a component of that larger thinking thing called algorithmic thinking, right? Where you think about breaking things down to steps to reach an outcome. So while they're just instructions, they are part of the larger thing that comes into grade 4. So talking about instructions, steps, and outcomes with the students is important. You could see, though, when you do take a look at the kindergarten component about making instructions and following instructions, that fits in the world of kindergarten teachers, I think. It's just a matter of bringing attention to steps and action and instructions and following instructions or steps to help heighten that. But certainly, as Chris said, working with instructions doesn't work only with science. We see that would be happening in phys ed, health, language arts, art, everything. And so it could be lots of practice with trying to meet those computer science outcomes in a variety of contexts. The blue part is just there, just thinking about the sequences and the steps. For example, in the kindergarten, it's about thinking about when actions don't correspond to instructions. So something happened and the action's wrong. Here's the instruction set, but the action is wrong. What happens? And so it's just investigating what happens when you don't follow steps. So yeah, it's not as scary as it maybe originally thought if you hadn't looked at this part of the science curriculum. We're not working with computers, although there's certainly people in kindergarten levels working with making instructions for their coding as well at that level. So it doesn't mean you can't do that either. If you have that resources and technology and support available to you, that would be great as well.
And this isn't a standalone organizing idea, right? Just by virtue of the way you see it right now laid out and the description that Ted just gave you should kind of prompt that we bring this up in every organizing idea in science, but we bring it up anywhere else that we can too. So although it has its own organizing idea in the curriculum and kind of its own section, it's not to be treated as a section to be taught in a month and then say, okay, we did the computing science, we're done. It should show up in every of the organizing ideas that we do. And that's why Anne will parachute in each time and give you some ideas. So there's the recording that Ange did. So you just need to click that on. It's 10 minutes. And that kind of goes to the end of our slide deck. I'm going to just get back down here. I'm going to